Good evening. I'm Jennifer Rabb, and I have the enormous privilege of serving as president of Hunter College, where in person or online, on campus or on Zoom, the American dream continues to come true as it has for 150 years. Speaking as well for our Jonathan Fanton Director of Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute, Harold Holzer, I'm delighted that one of the most important annual traditions at both Hunter and Roosevelt House is continuing this very evening, right on schedule, the Jack Newfield Lecture. Nothing and no one could ever stop Jack Newfield, and nothing can stop the event named in his honor either. During this time of isolation and separation, virtual programs like tonight's help us not only to stay connected to each other, but to stay connected to the values that continue to guide us through this challenging period. Values like the relentless search for truth that Jack Newfield reflected in his legendary journalism career. Of course, we look forward to the day when we can return again to the Roosevelt House location. But until then, we could not be more pleased to continue these lectures and conversations in the name of investigative journalist and Hunter alum, Jack Newfield, class of 1960, who managed to be both feared and beloved at the same time. Jack was a proud Hunter Bronx boy studying on our Bronx campus, and he often talked about the opportunities Hunter provided him as the son of a widowed working class mother. He never forgot his experiences as a student writer and editor of the school newspaper, the Hunter Arrow. One of the articles he published there, a piece on civil disobedience, earned him the nickname, the Trotsky of Tremont. Let's just say Hunter was Jack's launching pad. From his student days onward, Jack personified the Hunter motto, mihi cura futuri, the care of the future is mine. And whenever we forgot to care for the future, Jack was always there to remind us. That's why we are so proud to host these annual tributes to his legacy, which always turn out to be inspired discussions of the most pressing current events of our days. As with last year's memorable discussion between author and screenwriter Nick Pileggi and veteran journalist Sam Roberts, and the previous year's exchange between Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times colleagues Maggie Haberman and Mike Schmidt, tonight's event will explore and honor Jack's enduring influence on the landscape of journalism, a legacy he was until his final days eager to share. After decades as a reporter and columnist, Jack came to me with a proposal to teach a course at Hunter. We began to plan a hands-on seminar offering inspiring journalists the chance to learn the tricks of the trade Jack knew so well. Tragically, we lost Jack too soon, just as we were designing his class. But we knew no better way to address that loss than to continue what we started, and that is what led to the creation of the Jack Newfield Investigative Journalism Fellowship. It has thrived ever since through the generosity of our great friend Jack's wife, Janie Eisenberg, herself a graduate of Hunter School of Social Work, class of 1988, and the Newfield family, including Rebecca, their daughter, a graduate of Hunter School of Education, class of 2006. Janie, Rebecca, thank you for your support, your guidance, and inspiration. Originating the program as the inaugural Jack Newfield Professor of Investigative Journalism was the late award-winning journalist, author, Newfield collaborator, and friend, Wayne Barrett. The course Wayne taught on local, political, and investigative reporting featured a series of guest speakers from city and state government, as well as journalists who reported on them, uncovering, as Barrett said at the time, the drama of great city remaking itself again and again. Since then, this town has been remade many more times, but the chase for the truth and the facts that we need to make our life decisions remains the same. While subjects change, Jack and Wayne's journalistic credo continues to resonate. Never once claiming impartiality, Wayne described the technique Newfield taught him this way: discover, dissent, dig, reveal, confront, besiege, level, care. In keeping with that credo, students in Wayne's course were required to create their own version of the 10 Worst Landlords column, originated by Jack in the Village Voice decades earlier and continued by Wayne. At the end of the class, the Voice published it, giving many of the students their first taste of professional publication. For both Jack and Wayne, helping, inspiring, and constructively critiquing the younger generation of journalists was as much a part of the tradition of journalism as the reporting and writing itself. There could not have been a better journalist than Wayne to launch the Newfield program and to honor the Newfield legacy. Tonight, we gather in turn to honor and perpetuate Wayne's own journalistic legacy, as he was also lost too soon, less than 4 years ago. Wayne's first Village Voice byline appeared almost exactly 4 decades earlier in an article skewering brand new Mayor Ed Koch over what Wayne reckoned was his unfair treatment of the city's poorest communities. Wayne tirelessly maintained that same pitch and passion for justice for the rest of his life and career, generating miles of copy in which he held to account everyone from New York's top elected officials to party leaders, landlords, and of course, a certain brash real estate developer from Queens. He did so with such persistence and verve that even some of those on the receiving end of his scrutiny came to respect his method eventually. Along the way, he also authored several books, including with Jack, the acclaimed City for Sale, Ed Koch and the Betrayal of New York, Rudy, an investigative biography of Rudy Giuliani, and Trump, The Deals and Downfall, released in 2016 with Reinvention added to its subtitle. Tonight, we gather to celebrate and discuss a brand new book, Without Compromise, the brave journalism that first exposed Donald Trump, Rudy Giuliani, and the American epidemic corruption. This is the first collection of Wayne's investigations drawn from decades of determined reporting, hailed as an instantly classic collection by one of the greatest reporters New York ever produced and one of the greatest of his era. Without Compromise offers a view of the modern history of New York City through the lens of a reporter who took it as his personal, professional, and moral mission to expose abuse of power wherever he saw it, especially when it was of the detriment to the city's most vulnerable communities. Without Compromise also features contributions from Wayne's colleagues and those he mentored, including former Hunter College Newfield lecturers Jarrett Murphy and Errol Lewis, plus 2 of our panelists tonight, who also served as Newfield Fellows at Hunter, Andrea Bernstein and Tom Robbins. We could not have gathered a more accomplished panel to discuss the visionary journalism of Without Compromise and the continuing significance of Wayne's journalistic approach and its crucial importance in today's fraught times. But before we begin, we are going to hear from 2 very special guests who also knew Wayne well. First, we have the honor of hearing from none other than the Governor of New York, the Honorable Andrew Cuomo. We are delighted, Governor, that you are returning to Roosevelt House this evening, albeit virtually, like all of us. We will never forget that you signed the Women's Rights Bill here, and we've been honored that you visited several times since. We look forward to the day when we can welcome you back to 65th Street in person. But knowing how busy you are, we're so privileged to have you with us online tonight. Thank you for your extraordinary leadership these last 6 challenging months, and for all you do for Hunter College and the City University of New York. You have made so much possible for us during this difficult time, and our students, faculty, and whole CUNY community are so grateful. Thank you also for honoring Jack, Wayne, and the Hunter College with your presence tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome one of the country's most effective leaders, our own Governor, Andrew Cuomo.
My best regards to Janie Eisenberg and the entire Newfield family, to Mac Barrett, Fran Barrett, my talented colleague, and to all tonight's great participants. It's truly my honor to participate in the 2020 Jack Newfield Lecture. I wish we could all be together to celebrate tonight. I'm sure we all do, but our challenges continue. My standard for journalism is a bit out of sync with today's reality. I now realize that I was actually spoiled in my experience. I grew up in the home of Mario Cuomo, learning about journalism from Jack Newfield and Jimmy Breslin and Pete Hamill and Wayne Barrett. They exemplified a different school of journalism. The concept of a journalist's dialogue being reduced to 280 characters in a tweet would be revolting to them. The full story is seldom that simple or neat. The significance and ramifications never summarily concluded. When journalism becomes just a function of he said, she said, one side said the world was round, the other side said the world was flat. Well, then you can't be surprised when half the population thinks that the world is actually flat. No, they taught me that journalism at its best was about finding the truth, as hidden, difficult, complex, or uncomfortable as that truth may be. I didn't know at the time that they were simply the best, and in many ways the last of a higher endeavor. Now, that is not to say they weren't characters. They were. I remember the conversations when I was a kid with my father and Jimmy Breslin when they shared a bottle of scotch at a kitchen table in Queens. This was before they were both fully enlightened. Let's just say they would be brutally blunt in their assessment of the truth and the personal character traits of public officials at the time. I remember being surprised at how many elected officials were actually born out of wedlock. Jack Newfield was brilliant, unrelenting, and kind. He did not condemn as many as quickly to a fiery afterlife. He was patient with me, even though I knew he found me a slow learner. Wayne Barrett was one of a kind. Without Compromise is a perfect title. Wayne was always in pursuit of the truth and could be a ruthless prosecutor, especially on politicians. But that was his job as he saw it. I remember as a kid listening to my father argue with Wayne for hours. And that was when arguing was arguing, when off the record meant off the record, and before dialogue had our current refined PC style. That's when they used four-letter words besides love. Back when telephones were attached with a long curly cord. On those conversations, my father would pace back and forth, and the curly cord would become taut as a tightrope. My father would love to say to Fran, "I don't know how you can live with him. You are so nice and smart and so reasonable. If you ever want a divorce, I will represent you for free," he would say. Wayne once said about my father, quote, "There's no one in public life who I have more respect for than Mario Cuomo," close quote. That from Wayne, who also wrote a story about my father's administration entitled, quote, "Cuomo's Sleaze Team." Is that a contradiction? No, that is Wayne. His personal feelings or judgment did not dissuade him from pursuing the truth in any specific matter as he saw it. There are facets to the truth, and Wayne pursued all of them. I remember Wayne called me up one day after I was governor and said that I had signed a law that changed policy for a public utility company. And he asked me if that public utility company donated to my campaign. I said, I don't remember if I signed such a law, and I don't know if the public utility was a donor, but I would check, I'd call him back. I called him back and I said, I did in fact sign such a law, and no, the utility was not a donor. Wayne then asked me if I ever heard of an investment fund, let's call it Capital Investments, and if they were a donor. I said, I never heard of them, but I would check and I would call them back. I called them back and I said, no, Capital Investments Fund was not a donor. He then said, well, did you ever hear of a man? It's called John Smith. I said, no, I never heard of it. And I said, Wayne, I know you know all the facts. You don't ask a question that you don't have the answer. So just let's cut to the chase. Give me the accusation and let's address it. He said there was a man who was a donor to me and a partner in an investment firm, and the investment firm traded stock in the utility company. I said, Wayne, I have 20,000 donors. I never heard of the gentleman. And who cares if he traded stock in the utility? And as a matter of fact, I checked. The law I signed was a major negative to the public utility. So it could not be a benefit to a stock trader in any event. And Wayne said, well, that depends on whether the trader went long on the stock or short on the stock. You couldn't beat Wayne. I would say in the court of Barrett, you're guilty until proven innocent. And he would laugh that deep, guttural, self-satisfied laugh. That was Wayne, turning over every stone. Wayne was the first to disrobe Trump, the first to say the king has no clothes. He saw through the faux gold plating on the Trump name. He saw the true Trump story, greed and deception. He had the story on Trump's tax deals for a Grand Hyatt hotel, the celebrity con of The Apprentice, the scam which embodied Trump. He knew it first, and he was right. And if more of the American people had read Wayne, it would have saved this nation much pain and literally saved lives. Good journalism makes a society better. That is a simple and a true statement. Wayne made readers smarter, other journalists sharper, and my father and me and many others better public servants. And he did it all without compromise. We miss him. We miss them. We miss the truth. God bless you and have a good night.
Thank you so much for that, Governor, for that heartfelt tribute and for taking time from your demanding schedule to be with us tonight and for your leadership. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Jack Newfield's wonderful wife, Janie Eisenberg, whose support, again, we so value, and who witnessed the Wayne and Jack relationship firsthand. Whether as a student program or an annual lecture in the classroom or online, the Jack Newfield program has thrived because of her leadership and generosity and personal involvement. It's a multi-generational all-Hunter clan at the Newfield family, as you've heard, and their commitment has inspired all of us, and I dare say all of the teachers and speakers who have graced our stage to do their part in sharing Jack's enduring legacy with new generations of students, fellow journalists, faculty, and the public at large. Janie, I wish at this moment I could invite you to the Roosevelt House podium so we could all express our thanks to you for everything you've done. But we're doing the next best thing, inviting you by Zoom to share your thoughts with us tonight as we begin the third annual Newfield Lecture. Please, everyone, join me by hitting the applause button on Zoom to thank a wonderful woman I am honored to call a friend, Janie Eisenberg. Janie?
Thanks so much, Jennifer, for your insightful remarks and for your years of support of the Jack Newfield teaching and lecture program at Hunter. And Governor Cuomo, I'm so delighted that you can join us this evening for this special tribute to Wayne. It means a lot to all of us. What I want to talk about tonight is the relationship between Wayne Barrett and Jack Newfield. As I see it, the two shared a common obsession with righting wrongs and both strongly identified with underdogs. They first met in the early 70s when Wayne was living in Brownsville with his wife, Fran. Both were local activists, and he was teaching in a school in Ocean Hill, Brownsville. Wayne had founded and was running a local community paper called The Village Voice that covered and exposed community issues, including local community corruption. Jack and Wayne found themselves both writing about the misdeeds of the same Brooklyn politicians. This overlap eventually led to Wayne writing freelance articles and then being hired by The Village Voice as a staff writer in 1973 at the strong urging of Jack and Joe Conason, both Village Voice writers. Jack and Wayne's friendship and collaboration thrived during their years at The Voice. Each man developed their own investigative styles and techniques. Jack did all his own research and writing, and Wayne, who was a gifted teacher, worked closely with and trained generations of interns numbered in the hundreds with a ferocity and intensity that is legendary, many of whom have developed into first-class investigative journalists in their own right. Sometimes Jack and Wayne disagreed, but more often they collaborated on stories and generously shared information and counseled one another. According to Fran, it was Jack who suggested to Wayne that he look into Donald Trump as a player in New York City politics worthy of closer scrutiny, something we all know Wayne took on with incredible intensity and stuck with his whole career, to Trump's great dismay. Fran also recalled that Wayne felt Jack's genius was in conceptualizing and setting the frame for stories, and that his, Wayne's genius, was to fill in the details brilliantly. This was evident in a book they wrote together. That book was City for Sale, Ed Koch and the Betrayal of New York, a classic piece of investigative journalism about corruption in the years of Ed Koch's mayoralty that became a must-read for every investigative journalism class to this day. You can imagine how hard it must have been for these two brilliant, independent, and headstrong journalists who shared common goals and values to put aside their considerable egos to write a book together. In the acknowledgments section of City for Sale, Wayne and Jack wrote the following, quote, "Nick Pileggi read the manuscript in progress and mediated the occasional disagreements between us. He deserves the Nobel Peace Prize and has our gratitude," unquote. When Nick wasn't available, Fran and I were called in as peace negotiators. It wasn't the easiest collaboration, but the end result was a gem. On a personal note, I'm forever grateful to Wayne, who spoke and wrote selflessly and often about Jack's importance as an investigative journalist after he died in 2004. He helped keep Jack's name and reputation alive by what he said and did. And I'm happy to continue that tradition tonight as we celebrate the publication of Wayne's book, Without Compromise, and Wayne's legacy as a great investigative journalist.
Thank you so much, Janie. Now, let me welcome and introduce tonight's extraordinary panelists, 2007 Jack Newfield Fellow, Tom Robbins. Tom has been a reporter covering New York crime and politics for more than 30 years, including stints at the Village Voice and the New York Daily News. Since 2011, he has been an investigative journalist in residence at CUNY's Craig Newmark School of Journalism. Tom, I am so pleased that you began your CUNY tenure at Hunter through the Newfield program. 2017 Jack Newfield Fellow, Andrea Bernstein, is the author of American Oligarchs, The Kushners, the Trumps, and the Marriage of Money and Power. She is also a Peabody Award-winning co-host of the acclaimed WNYC ProPublica podcast, Trump Inc. And of course, she too taught and mentored young aspiring journalists as part of the Jack Newfield program here at Hunter. Welcome and thank you again, Andrea. Join me also in welcoming Eileen Markey, a colleague from Lehman College. Without Compromise was meticulously assembled and edited by Eileen, an investigative journalist, a Lehman College journalist professor, and a former Barrett intern, who is also the author of A Radical Faith, The Assassination of Sister Mora. Leading tonight's conversation is veteran journalist Cheryl McCarthy, a former education editor at the New York Daily News, national correspondent at ABC News, and longtime columnist at New York Newsday. Now a distinguished journalism lecturer at Queens College, Cheryl hosts the illuminating CUNY TV talk show, 1 to 1. And later, after the panelists conclude their discussion, Wayne's son, Mac Barrett, our own Roosevelt House Curator of Public Programs, will be here to moderate the public Q&A. What a perfect coda to this evening's event that will be. With that, please join me in welcoming, in Jack's name, tonight's esteemed panel. To launch the discussion, it is my pleasure to hand it over to veteran journalist Cheryl McCarthy. Thank you and welcome, Cheryl.
Welcome, panel. In the preface to Without Compromise, Joe Conason writes that Wayne Barrett's lifelong project was to muster journalistic truth on behalf of the downtrodden and against their oppressors. This is whether he was writing about a poverty pimp who used his political ties to siphon off millions of dollars in anti-poverty funds, or about how Governor Pataki and Mayor Giuliani's budget cuts disproportionately targeted programs that served the poor and people of color. And in pursuing that truth, Conason says, Wayne Barrett produced, quote, some of the most rigorous, purposeful, and dogged investigative reporting ever written. Eileen, you edited the book. Why the book and why now?
Thanks very much. It's great to be here with everybody. I'm glad we can all be together, such as it is, and it's good to be with all these excellent colleagues. So Wayne died the night before Donald Trump was inaugurated as president. It was a poetic and heartbreaking departure. But in these last 4 years, Wayne is cited almost ritualistically in any serious piece of investigative journalism that looks into the president, particularly into his conflicting business interests and how they privatize profit from the common good. But really, so many of these investigative pieces have cited Wayne, and it always is, as legendary investigative reporter Wayne Barrett wrote in the Village Voice, and then whatever the great new project is continues with its new findings. And we realized that his work is cited so much, but it wasn't available to people. And so we wanted to make it available. We wanted people to be able to, who kept hearing this name, right? Newsreaders who are very interested and I think have a renewed respect and understanding that democracy really depends on serious journalism. We wanted them to be able to look at the original documents, which is really fitting. One of Barrett's famous reporting methods was to go get the document, to go get the original. And so we wanted readers to be able to have the original and to see who this guy was who kept getting cited. And so we put this book together so people would be able to look at it, not only the reporting on Donald Trump way back in the 70s, but 40 years of reporting on New York City.
You refer to the Wayne Barrett method. Now, journalists will often say that all journalism is investigative, all reporting is investigative reporting. But I think we would agree that the kind of investigative reporting that Wayne Barrett did was in a category of its own. Can you describe, and this is for either one of you on the panel, the reporting method that, or methods that allowed him to get the kind of information that he got?
I'd like to address that because well, first of all, let me say thank you to the Roosevelt House. Thank you to the Barrett family. And thank you to Jennifer and Janie. And also, it was a great privilege to teach the Jack Newfield course in investigative journalism. The students were wonderful. So in the course of reporting our podcast and in the book, my book, American Oligarchs, I thought about Wayne and his advice like every day. I have thought about Wayne and his advice every day for the past 4 years almost. And there are things that Wayne taught me about journalism that seem so obvious, and yet almost nobody does. So one of the things was read the court file, every single page of it. And that is something that I did, and I learned that directly from Wayne. And people will say, how do you find those things? Well, I found them in the court file. How did you know to do that? I knew it from Wayne Barrett. Also, to just not give up on finding things. There's always somebody who will tell you things. And one of the things that I've sort of figured out over the years is that the sort of people, you can sort of get the sense of who Wayne spoke to. And it is extraordinary, the breadth of people that spoke to Wayne Barrett, whose trust he earned. And lastly, about the Wayne Barrett method is that he had a certain kind of understanding of how power works and always looking at the thing behind the thing. And that stays with me always. So I'm sure there's a lot of elements to it, and Wayne means a lot to a lot of people. But for me, and asking myself almost every day, what would Wayne do? And it was always good advice, even though he passed it, as Eileen said, an almost poetic passing.
Tom, I considered myself probably the last American to get a cell phone, but you mentioned in one of your articles that Wayne managed to do all of the reporting that he did without a cell phone, and obviously this was in the time before the internet and before Google. So, what do you want to say about his reporting methods?
In addition to Andrea's description, I would say that one of Wayne's fairly unique approaches to his stories was that he believed in knocking on every door, often no matter what time of day it was. The very first story that I did with Wayne for The Voice back in the mid-'80s, we were working hot on the trail of a story that we thought was significant and was exposing something important about misuse of city funds. And we really hadn't reported out most of the details, but we found ourselves in South Brooklyn, not far from the home of the people that we knew that we were going to sort of feature in this story. And Wayne pulled up outside and he said, let's go knock on the door. And it was just about this time of year, and it got dark early. And I was like, well, wait a minute, like these folks are probably eating dinner, like, are we really just going to go knock on their door? And he said, come on. And we went and we knocked on the door and they opened it. And I remember to this day, the look on their face. It's Wayne Barrett at my door. And I think Wayne had this understanding that people wanted to talk. Maybe, Wayne dallied with the idea of joining the seminary at one point. I think he sometimes saw himself as a kind of father confessor to people. But indeed, these folks ushered us into their living room and gave their side of the story and did themselves a world of good, by the way, by, sort of opening up and telling us how things had come to be. And I don't think the story was nearly as tough as it was still a tough story, but it wasn't as tough as it would have been if they'd slammed the door shut on Wayne's face at that moment. And I saw that as his MO throughout the time that he worked, and his interns would be full of the stories of like stakeouts and door knocking. And Wayne believed in person-to-person contact. So who needed a cell phone?
When Wayne started reporting a story, did he start out by just trying to gather as much information on the subject as possible that he was investigating, sort of throw it all up on the wall and then figure out what the story was? Or did he start out by asking a specific question and then try to answer that question? Or was it a combination of both?
I think, one of the titles that we considered for this book before we settled on this one was Fact Patterns. And Wayne talked that way. I think he often came to a story from a suggestion from a source, or somebody would send him a tip, or somebody would say, hey, you should look into this. There's something shady going on over there. But then he would just start pulling thread to understand what it was. Tom is described in some other conversation as that Barrett swallowed stories whole, that he just, like drank a lake to get every piece of information, every fact that could be found. And so, it would lead with a tip or with a suspicion or with an idea. And he was able to report for so long and on a beat that it meant he knew a lot. And you're reporting one story and obviously that leads to another, right? You're reporting this story, but in the course of it, you learn about this other little thing. And maybe you can circle back to that a month later or a year later. And so he could work on stories for a long time and just tickle them as he went, right? Be able to do a bit of reporting at a time. But it very much was a discovery. And he spoke about that our job is not dissertation, it's discovery, that we need to be finding new things. And so it's not that he began with a theory and Jack Newfield actually said this in his book, The Education of Jack Newfield, that reporting begins with the specific and goes to the general, not the other way around. So Barrett assembled facts, and he assembled facts, I think, like infantry. And then all the facts, you have them, and then you figure out what the story is. What is it that all of these disparate facts are telling you? But you get there by relentlessly gathering as much information as you possibly can. And like Andrea says, reading the entire court file. Now we can do that fairly easily with electronic court records. Then you
Not
had
so
to
easy back
copies.
then.
You had to send an intern down to the courthouse to get copies of everything. And knocking on every single door and reading the probate records and figuring out who somebody's second cousin was in case they might know something, and looking at real estate records and divorce records. And but it meant, it meant that he believed that the facts were, that they existed, that they were findable. And the challenge was simply in doing enough hard work that you could figure out what they were. And then you had the great joy of delivering them to the readers, this great vocation, this great public service of, look, readers, I've gone out and done this work, and now I can tell you something.
That God was in the details, really.
I just wanted to add two
Or the
quick
devil.
things to that. When I first sort of met Wayne and I was starting out in journalism, he once said something to me, "You don't know who will talk to me." And that to me has been really a big credo, because it's true. People say, oh, so-and-so will never talk to you. But many times so-and-so will talk to you. The other thing about, Tom, what you were saying is I realize how I have now passed on these techniques to younger than me journalists. We did a podcast episode about tax assessors who say they were bribed by the Trump organization, like literally cash under the table in envelopes to lower their tax assessments. And we reported this story. It was right on the eve of the pandemic. And the reporter that was working on it, Catherine Sullivan, went all over the tri-state area to find everybody who was involved in the case. And as you say, Tom, dinner time. It's a wonderful time to stop by. And I realized that Wayne's techniques are sort of proliferating beyond those of us who just had the good fortune to know him and learn from him.
Wayne came from a middle-class, Catholic, Goldwater Republican family in Lynchburg, Virginia. What turned him into this, I'm not going to call him a flaming liberal, but very progressive, someone obsessed with championing the poor and oppressed and people of color who are suffering from the greed of those who use the public trust for private gain? What happened?
Well, I assert that he went to college in Philadelphia at St. Joseph's, and while there he met a very great woman named Frances McGettigan, and she just turned that Goldwater kid's head right around. Set him on the right road.
Okay. Did it also have something to do with the fact that they lived in Brownsville for a while?
After they got together, they certainly did live in Brownsville, but that was by choice. You know, they chose to live in a neighborhood that was one of the poorest in the city, and which was the exact mirror image of Lynchburg, Virginia, where Wayne was raised. I mean, look, Wayne was a person of great contradictions, you know, and one of them was the one you're just touching on, Cheryl, which is that he came from the Deep South. His first jobs were on a newspaper where his editors mocked his copy when he wrote about Black social events. You know, what are you doing, they said, literally ripping it up in front of him, you know. And I think those experiences really touched him to his core, that he, as much as he may have felt like in a conservative family that, you know, maybe Republicans were the way to go, he understood, I think, at his very inner core that there was something essentially wrong with the racism that was pervasive in his community. And when he got out of college and he went to Columbia Journalism School in 1968, obviously a year that was so crucial for so many people, covered Bobby Kennedy's campaign, came home to New York, you know, I think he very much wanted to make that, you know, the core, the cradle of his life. He became a teacher, by the way, at first. You know, he wasn't
Right.
a journalist.
We've talked about how Wayne was lured to the Village Voice by Jack Newfield. And Tom, you worked with them for a long time. I'm interested in their relationship. Was Newfield Wayne's mentor, or how did that work?
Wayne described himself as Jack's only intern. But as Janie alluded to in her introductory remarks, it wasn't always a smooth road. There's a famous story of when Jack first went out to Brownsville to meet with Wayne when he was still writing for the People's Voice about some of the abuses that he had found. And they sat down in a deli on Pitkin Avenue, and Wayne began to recount in the kind of detail that only Wayne could all the characters and all the names and all the shenanigans that he'd uncovered. And Jack sat there sort of trying to follow this pattern. And at one point, Jack said, well, wait a minute, who's this guy? And Wayne said, you haven't listened to a single word I've said, have you? You know, that was sort of Wayne. He was like, as the intensity was like, not even then, before he'd even written a word for the Village Voice. There isn't, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. What was the Village Voice like? What kind of place was it like to work, you know, back in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, that allowed Wayne to develop into the reporter that he became?
Well, I didn't get there to the 80s, but I was a close reader of him and Jack and Joe Conason and lots of other people who were great reporters for the place. The Village Voice, as Fred McDarrah, the great photographer, used to always say, is a place of many voices. They would let their reporters speak. They had editors who would sort of try to corral these enormous egos and try to put them, sometimes translate them into English somewhat more than they originally arrived. But they were allowed to be able to pursue things that they had a passion for. And I think that Wayne's passions were clearly recognized. I mean, his early targets, guys like Sam Wright, who had corrupted Brownsville and like tried to suck every nickel out of the poverty programs that were going into this poor neighborhood. This was clearly a voice-worthy target. And then as Wayne sort of worked his way up the money tree and began to understand the larger umbrella of power going up to the Democratic Party titans who controlled people like Sam Wright, you know, it was like right squarely in the zone for the Village Voice.
You referred to the egos at the Village Voice. A friend of mine, a woman who worked at the Voice back in those days, said she talked about all of the guys who had super egos, and she said she found it refreshing to be around Wayne because he was not an egomaniac. Eileen, did you want to say something?
No, I don't want to say anything about that. But about Brownsville, I think the fact that Fran and Wayne decided to live in Brownsville in 1968 had everything. You know, obviously his thinking had changed from a Goldwater Republican by the time he made a decision like that. By the time he decided to become a public school teacher in Brownsville and become a teacher in the independent school district in Brownsville. But that experience of living in Brownsville, you know, for a good 15 years, absolutely shaped the person he became. And so when I was trying to put together this book, realizing that he wrote almost every week for 37 years, and there's miles and miles of copy, but a tiny sliver of them would end up in this book. And we already knew that a couple big names needed to be in it. You're right, I was trying to figure out how do we corral this book? I felt like I was doing a digging operation, and that my job was to figure out what drove Wayne. There are a lot of good reporters in New York City. There used to be a more robust investigative journalism operation at each of the dailies. There's still really strong investigative journalism in this city, and now there's all these independent investigative outlets. But there was something about Wayne that's different, and we speak about him in different terms than some other really skilled diggers. And it was his anger. Right? I mean, we speak about this in a funny way, and that he had a bark, and he shouted, and he was angry. But it was also that there was this righteous anger that drove his copy, and so he didn't become cynical, and he didn't become world weary, and really kind of part of the game of yeah, right. I report on powerful people, and we kind of go to the same places together, and we know the same kinds of things, and it's all kind of a game. He was angry at injustice. He was absolutely outraged that anyone would deign to take from the public till, to turn their work in public service to private gain. And I wanted to really understand that because he wasn't naive, right? He was not a rube. And yet he was able to keep this fire of anger going for years. And so I felt like it was my job. You know, the question I was asking is what drove Wayne Barrett, and that's really what kind of helped craft what ends up in the book. Um, and so when I was in Austin, Texas, at the University of Texas, at the Briscoe Center for American History, which has this great collection of all kinds of great journalists, including Jack and Wayne, digging through his boxes, and Andrea went there as well. The history of New York City since 1975 is contained in almost 300 boxes in this university library in Texas. And on the last day that I was able to be there, and in the last box that I was able to look at before I had to go to the airport, I found his notebooks from Brownsville. And I found poems he wrote in Brownsville, and photographs of decrepit, horrible apartment buildings that people were living in absolutely Dickensian conditions, right? And the notes for his story about Sam Wright, who was this poverty pimp from Brownsville, who had turned a really beautiful and radical idea of a self-governing neighborhood into his own personal gain. And it just made Wayne mad. And I think it made him mad for 40 years. And he eventually went over after targets who were bigger than Sam Wright and who were known to more people. But finding that notebook and finding the notes for the Sam Wright article, it was like Rosebud. It was like a Rosebud moment. Like, yeah, this is what drove this crazy guy. This is why he was able to keep working at this absurd rate and absurd pace. He thought that we deserved better. He thought that we deserved decent governance. And I think we're all kind of battered and sort of so like gnat-brained by how we receive news nowadays that we might forget that the purpose of journalism, you know, Wayne really loved this kind of hammy phrase that we're the detectives for the people, but he really believed that.
You were one of the fabled Wayne Barrett interns. I gather there were hundreds of them over the years that he trained to be good reporters, investigative reporters. What was that like?
It was great. It was the toughest job you'll ever love. You know, most of us worked there when in college or right after college. I was in between my junior and senior years at Fordham University, covering for him or with him, under him, the Giuliani's re-election campaign. And I think I spent my summer mostly on the E train out to the Queens Courthouse to get the concrete permit for so-and-so's building on Cross Bay Boulevard that would prove so-and-so's mob connection, a minor DEP official. I still remember that guy, and I remember who signed that permit. But what we learned there is, like we've been saying, right, that facts were knowable, that it was an outrage that somebody would be doing something not for the common good, that someone would dare to cheat, that someone would dare to cheat the public, and that there's a joy and a thrill in the hunt of finding it out. And then when you find that piece of paper, that is fantastic. You know, and one of the things I think a lot of us who were interns would say is that we learned over and over again the value of a fact, the value of reporting, that it's worth walking a mile or it's worth spending 3 weeks on the E train to get a fact, right? And when that article came out, I realized that my summer amounted to a clause. Right? It amounted to a clause in an article. And it's not one of the articles in this book. It's not one of his famous articles. I don't think it led to an indictment. But that this is serious business being a journalist, that we're doing really important work, that we are a front line in preserving democracy and a front line in keeping people honest. And that it's worth sweating for that. And it's worth kind of cold sweating for that with a voice on the phone to do the good work and to go farther. And of course, everybody has these, you know, these kind of battle stories of working for Wayne, which I think gives us all a little sense of swagger. But obviously, the interns, we got this free journalism education, right? We got a degree in journalism by working with this guy. He took us seriously. It meant that he thought we were worth training, that we had potential, that we were worth passing on this craft to and passing on this vocation and mission. And he kept in touch with us and took care of us for the next forever. So, you know, every recommendation letter, every job offer, every job recommendation, every, you know, hey, a little email, so-and-so's hiring, are you looking? You know, in those years when a lot of people are kind of between things and between places to live, do you need to stay in the beach house? Do you, right? So that there's this whole collection of of people who had, an extra godfather, an extra person looking
Right.
for them really kindly. Yeah.
Sounds
I
like
could
Ruth
just-
Ginsburg and her clerks, that kind of relationship. Andrea, you and Wayne work for competing news organizations. Even so, you were out there at the same time, I guess sometimes covering the same stories. What kind of relationship did you have with him? Was he a mentor to you? What was that like?
So I'm gonna, be like Mike Pence and answer something else first.
Okay, okay.
I will answer that, but I just wanted to say to what Eileen was saying about the anger is I think that is really because I also did the pilgrimage to the Briscoe Center in Texas, which I recommend to everybody. And I think that, that is really what made him so angry about Trump. Decades before other people were. Other people were sort of, here's this kind of buffoony guy, and funny. And Wayne was mad. And Wayne was mad because Trump was taking money from the taxpayers, huge amounts, getting these huge tax breaks when, people in Brownsville did not have homes or had very poor homes. And that really made him mad. And then the way that Trump was able to sort of get these deals and evade any accountability for it, charm FBI agents, all of it, I think, did make Wayne mad and made him understand, really, in 1990, who Trump was. I mean, I've read all the Trump books for my book, like hundreds of them, and they all go back to Wayne. No one has been able to sort of reproduce some of the stuff that he did at the very beginning. So I just wanted to say, yes, I agree. And I think that is what led him to understand who our president was really way, way, way before everybody else. Now, what was it like working with Wayne? I mean, Wayne, I worked for the New York Observer. This was before Jared Kushner bought it, many years. And Wayne was so helpful. His attitude was, which is something that I sort of have brought this ethos to our Trump Inc. reporting podcast. His ethos was, if you're doing it, great. I'm not going to waste my time on that thing because you'll get that story and there's so much corruption to uncover. I'll go work on my piece. And that is something that we have really sort of tried to build on in our reporting project. I mean, we give documents, we give tips to Washington Post or Bloomberg that we can't follow. And then if we need a document, we'll call up and say, do you have this deposition? I can't find it. And that is something that, I learned from Wayne at a so-called rival publication. I mean, he would sometimes tell me where to find things. He would say, like, here's the key, here's the lobbying record you need to go look up to find out how to unlock your story. A story that I like to tell is Wayne was arrested twice. The first time he was arrested when he was trying to uncover some opening, quote unquote, opening night party or birthday party at the Trump Taj Mahal. And the second, and he wasn't allowed in. He was barred from that event and he went anyway. And they stuck him in jail in Atlantic City for the night. And the second, he froze.
She's gonna tell a great story. She's gonna tell a great story, which is recounted in her essay. I'm sure she'll be back momentito.
We knew Donald Trump. Shortly thereafter, we were arrested and taken and booked in the basement of the Waldorf Astoria. And the charges were eventually dismissed on a technicality.
Trump wrote numerous articles about the organized looting of New York City by all kinds of characters. And, one of the takeaways I got from reading the book was that it seems that no big project gets done in New York City. No big contract gets awarded. No big position is acquired without someone paying off a public official, or maybe more than one. Is that true?
Well, I would amend it just slightly, Cheryl. I would say that no big project gets done without people trading favors that may not be prosecutable crimes, but which amount to the same thing. And that was
Quid pro quo.
quid pro quo.
Right, okay.
And I think that was one of Wayne's really strengths, was that he could follow these threads. I mean, the story that Governor Cuomo began to tell about Wayne hammering away at him about, well, isn't there a guy who worked for an investment house who got this and got that? Wayne would follow the thread. You know, one of the things that Wayne was very proud about was that the FBI had him come down to Quantico years ago to spend 2 days, not on a panel, but just by himself lecturing all of the public corruption agents who worked for the FBI from across the country, because his manner of excavating corruption was to them so unique and so valuable. They knew that they had something to share, and Wayne recognized that, like, you know, this is like, you know, I was talking before about the contradictions. You know, Wayne never won the big prizes in our business. You know, we have a business that gives away lots of prizes. Andrea has a shelf full of them. Andrea's got something, you know, Cheryl, you've got some. Wayne's biggest prize, I think, came from his alma mater, Columbia Journalism School. And yet at his funeral, it was filled with the greatest names of New York journalism. And, you know, the other conundrum about Wayne that still, he actually talked in the couple of years before he died about how, you know, no politician will ever carry my casket. You know, he was and yet you looked out in the crowd and there was a governor, and there was a US senator, and there was a borough president, and there were city council members. You know, there were so many contradictions in the life of Wayne Barrett.
Why do you think he didn't win the big prizes? Is
Well,
that something controlled by an elite, or why do you think that was?
Well, other people might have better ideas, but look, the Village Voice was never seen as on the same level that the big broadsheets were, that the dailies were. It was very difficult to break out. I mean, you know, one of the things I try to touch on in the essay that Eileen asked me to write about Wayne's relationship with Rudy Giuliani was that Jack and Wayne kept saying there's a lot of problems afoot in city government. There's a burgeoning scandal here, and it wasn't taken seriously because Ed Koch scoffed and wouldn't even talk to the Village Voice. And so the other dailies more or less followed the mayor's lead. Rudy Giuliani was smart enough to recognize, wait a minute, there's something here. And he would sit with Jack and Wayne, and he would be the one taking notes. You know, they would sort of gave him an education in how the city worked. But that wasn't something that translated into laudatory plaudits from the community of journalism. I think, you know, today they would heap awards on Wayne. I think everybody recognizes his contribution. But at the time that he was writing some of the greatest journalism, as you said, in the city's history, and that Jennifer Raab said, there wasn't much recognition of that.
It's interesting that Wayne seemed to have a love affair with Giuliani, the prosecutor, but came to really dislike him as a mayor. And I know that, Tom, you've talked, well, Wayne wrote a story about the really blatant racism that was inherent in Giuliani's budget decisions. And you've talked about, you know, Wayne exposing the racism that existed in the city. But that was very interesting.
I mean, I think that
Go ahead.
I think that Rudy Giuliani in the 1980s was not the Rudy Giuliani that people know now. So anybody who wasn't alive in the 1980s should be really clear on that. But I do think that there has been this tradition of sort of prosecutors who, when they're sort of ambitious prosecutors and they want to root out corruption, can be huge friends to journalists and to truth, because they can find things that we cannot find. And Rudy Giuliani definitely played that role for a period in New York City. I mean, it's stunning to me that, you know, he sent Roy Cohn's former law partner to jail for one of the longest sentences in the history of New York, which is based on a series of stories that Wayne wrote. And that was Rudy. And then here we have Rudy now, at the center of the impeachment scandal. So I think it's a sort of a long historical arc. So I do think that it is a different Rudy Giuliani, but I also feel that if you go back to the sort of way that he single-mindedly did want to ferret out actual corruption versus made-up corruption, which is what he's doing now, he was assertive, kind of friend to the endeavor that Wayne was working at, which was to get at the truth.
Right.
Tom writes about this really beautifully, obviously, in his essay, and he uses this great phrase, the incredible shrinking Rudy, that, like, I think a lot of people who've been watching New York for this long, or maybe really people who only know this Rudy Giuliani, might have heard you say that Barrett admired Rudy and said, but as Andrew is saying, he was this great prosecutor who was putting away the clubhouse, who was breaking up the mob, who was fighting the same enemies that Jack and Wayne thought were corrupting politics. But Tom nailed it in his essay, where he refers to Rudy as a moral sinkhole that had only grown larger with the years. I think Wayne thought that Rudy was like him, and he wasn't, we see. But in those early years, it seemed like they were cut from a similar cloth, a similar, like, Old Testament right and wrong kind of avenging angel cloth. And of course, Rudy didn't nurture those parts of himself, and he grew into this person we see. And Wayne kept up his rigor and worked to be the person he wanted to actually be. I wanted to, thinking about how Wayne's work was received in the years that he was writing it versus in his last year of life and in these years after his death, he was really prescient, right? But he wasn't a soothsayer. It's not like he had some magic crystal ball to be able to say that Donald Trump was corrupt to the core. It's not like he had some magic glasses or something that allowed him to see structural racism in the treatment of Brownsville when most other white people didn't use those terms. He was a reporter. He was a good reporter. He knew the things he knew because he reported them, because he found the facts, because he looked at the papers, and also because he planted himself where he did, which meant he saw certain things. So, you really see the world from where you stand. And if you're going to bed in Brownsville at night in 1983, you're going to know a couple things about the world that you're not going to know if you're pulling up the covers in some other place. And
What stories, let me just interrupt, what stories did Wayne seem to be the most proud of? Did you get an indication of that?
Well, I can tell you that one of the things that Wayne took great pride in was the fact that at one point during the Bloomberg Bill Thompson campaign in 2000, help me here, Andrea, Eileen, 2009.
2009.
Both candidates made ads using Wayne's stories about the other guy. Wayne had written a devastating story about Bloomberg that Bill Thompson used, and he had written an equally devastating story about Thompson that Bloomberg used. Similarly, there's no question but that he loved the fact that Al D'Amato called him a viper. He loved the fact that Al D'Amato, who he wrote some of his toughest copy about relentlessly over the years, and who he long believed had been, he would tell me that he thought he was the single most corrupt person that he had encountered on his beat, even though he never, as we know, has done a day in jail, and probably, has never done certainly a crime that anyone has found to be indictable. But he recognized Wayne as being his constant critic, no matter where he was. And Chuck Schumer, who spoke at Wayne's funeral, was the target of some of Wayne and Jack's toughest stories in the early 1980s about stuff that he did. And
I think the book makes it pretty clear that he was nonpartisan.
Yes, he was.
In his reporting.
Yes, he was.
I'd like to hear from each of you, if you had to pick a particular story or a particular series of stories on a certain subject from Wayne's body of work that either you thought was really important or had a significant impact on you, what would it be?
You want to go, Andrea? Or do you want to?
I mean, it's, you know, Trump has so filled my head that it's hard for me to think of other stories now. Which, I mean, you know,
I got one.
finishing, I mean, let me just sort of answer that slightly sideways, which is, you know, when Wayne passed hours before Trump was inaugurated, I mean, it was really a devastating blow. And, you know, Tom mentioned his funeral and I was just, you know, sobbing. I was like, Wayne, how can you not be here with us anymore? And I think that, you know, his spirit really infused me. You know, I mean, I'm not the only one, but I felt like I have to be one of the people who carries on this work of Wayne's. And one of the things that I learned when I was down at the Briscoe Center, and I write about this in my essay in the book, in Without Compromise, is that there was a big story that we did in October of 2017 about how Don Jr. and Ivanka Trump were almost indicted for felony fraud by Cy Vance, who, as we now know, is investigating Trump again. But at the time, Cy Vance dropped the case after a visit from Trump's lawyer, who was one of his biggest donors. And I wrote this story with my colleagues at ProPublica and The New Yorker. And then when I was down at the Briscoe Center in June of, I guess, 2019, and I was reading through Wayne's papers and looking through his notes, I realized that he was actually working on the same story, that he had sort of uncovered the initial fact pattern and he hadn't finished it, but he was onto it. And that was a sort of extraordinary revelation for me, that not only was it the spirit of Wayne, but it was his sort of actual story that he was working on that, unbeknownst to us, we had finished.
Tom, do you have a pick?
Well, I urged Eileen to use this one in the book just because I just remember reading it slack-jawed at the time. It is a fairly simple but incredibly tragic and I think uniquely Wayne Barrett story about a 16-year-old Asian student in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, who is killed by a brick that is blown off the roof of a school. And there were stories about that.
Yes.
And it made, you know, people wrote about it. Wayne made it his business to trace back through the records to point out that the guy who had been the monitor for that construction job, what the brick was being used in, was the husband of a district leader of the Conservative Party who worked for the School Construction Authority, and that in exchange that she had gotten her job through another political patronage appointment by the governor to the board of the School Construction Authority. I mean, and he interviewed the principal of the school, who told how she had repeatedly tried to get the agency to fire this monitor, this politically connected guy who was supposed to be keeping an eye on the work site, because he would show up drunk or not at all. And it was just one of those things, you know, that sort of touched all the bases in the world of Wayne. And that, you know, here was, you know, real lifeblood being shed because of the fact that, like, someone felt that political connections and cutting a deal with someone was more important than actually doing a good job.
I agree. I think that was actually, now that you say that, I remembered at the time, and I remember just being stunned, because here was a case where a child had died because of corruption. And, you know, for those of us who cover corruption, like, people are like, okay, there's nepotism. Is that really so bad? Somebody's child got a job. But here it was, Wayne showing that, yes, these decisions are life and death. I agree with you, Tom.
Eileen, do you have a favorite?
So I had the great privilege and joy for the last year of just diving into these stories. I mean, I read, you know, I came to New York in 1994 and I started reading Wayne then, and so I read those years. But in the last year, I read all the others too. And so I read miles and miles and miles of Wayne Barrett copy. But in trying to choose which ones mattered, I think the ones that really affected me, maybe because I actually was able to read them on paper because I had these couple of years of bound volumes from the early 90s, were a series of articles about the post-Gingrich New York State budget. So after the Gingrich Revolution of 94, when, it's a couple years into Rudy's term by now, and Wayne writes a series of articles about the budget that Rudy Giuliani is proposing, and a variation of which was eventually adopted by the city. And, he'd already changed his opinion about the kind of person that Rudy Giuliani was, but they had a relationship, right? They had once been close. And so there's this longing in the way he writes these articles. One of them is addressed as a letter to Rudy. And they're so clear-eyed. I think in reading, because of course you read a paper copy, you read all the other articles around it as well. Those articles from the mid-90s in the Village Voice, Wayne's, but the other kind of cultural reporting that was around them, it was raising the alarm bell about the choices that the society was making. And they were outraged and shocked and sort of aghast at the meanness and the cruelty of the Gingrich Revolution, of the budget choices that were being made. And just sort of agog and saying, this isn't what we're supposed to be like. I mean, maybe the Voice was often agog, but here they were saying, no, we don't want to be this way. And Wayne he wrote 3 exhaustive budget stories in the spring of 1995, saying this budget will destroy the city. This budget will cut the knees off of this city and will be feeling its effects for a generation. And he called them racist. He said that these are, one of the stories is called The Color of the Cuts. Who's going to get hurt by this? And people throw around that term, but Wayne got the receipts on it, right? He read all the records of who was employed in what agency, and so what agencies are getting cut and what agencies are avoiding budget cuts. Oh, look at this. He could find the records to figure out who was who in which agency, and saying the agencies that have more African-American people in them are suffering more cuts than the agencies that have more white people in them. That's a heck of a lot more powerful than just saying this is racist, right? He had the facts to back it up. But he also had that analysis to say budgets are not morally neutral documents. Budgets are not socially neutral documents, that this adoption of an austerity model is going to hurt, and that we're making choices here that we're going to feel. And so I made sure that we included those early 90s articles in the book, so that I think of the book really as kind of like a coroner's report. A lot of us, I think, are feeling in the last several years confused and dazed and not, people keep saying, I don't recognize the country. How did we get here? How did we get to this place? And I think of Without Compromise as this coroner's report. Well, let me show you how we got here. Wayne did the reporting, has the I's dotted and the T's crossed to tell us, when we look in retrospect, we see that he was telling us what was happening.
Right.
And that if we want to understand how we got to this week, right, this week in governance, it starts in 1979. It starts in 1977 in choices that were made in New York City during the fiscal crisis about what to value, whose lives to value,
Right.
What priorities to have, in what sort of a city we rebuild. So,
Tom, how did Wayne's getting laid off from The Voice in 2011 affect him?
Well, it threw him. I mean, I think Cheryl, he was stunned. I mean, initially, because he had been there his entire working life. He had put in more time, given it more credibility, certainly in terms of news breaking, than anybody ever associated with the paper. And, the short-sighted people who controlled the paper at that time didn't want to pay his salary. But I will never forget that afternoon when he came in and he got the news that he was going, and it, he took it well enough on the scene, but I think he just had but then he quickly got up. He went over to the Nation, and very quickly formed the kind of alliance with the nation that he'd had with The Voice. He said, "I want to bring my interns with me." and, and he had his interns camped out. Yes, he did. He had a cluster of interns at the nation's investigative unit who were working on his stories, and then he branched out and continued to write for a whole bunch of places. I mean, over the years, his byline ended up in the Daily News a lot, and ended up in the Daily Beast. It ended up in a lot of publications that he'd never written for before, and allowed him sort of to spread his wings. And if it hadn't been for this lousy disease that hit him, there's no question in my mind but that Wayne would be turning out, some of the strongest, toughest copy in the country right now, particularly about this moment in time.
Now, you left The Voice, you resigned shortly afterwards, right? Shortly after Wayne left, is that correct?
Well, I quit the day he was fired. I said,
Oh, did you? Okay.
I
Okay.
mean, Wayne had brought me to The Voice twice, both
Okay.
in the 80s and again in 2000. And I just said to the guys there, if you don't need Wayne Barrett, you don't need me. They asked me to stick around for another month and continue writing the column I was writing at the time, which I agreed to do. And then we both left a few weeks later formally, or I forget how we, announced it. But
You
look,
said I want to go out with the guy who brought me to the dance.
okay. All
In
right.
the last 20 years, so many newspapers and magazines have shut down, downsized, reduced their coverage. What does this say for the future of investigative journalism? Does it have a future? What do you see happening?
I mean, it needs a future. We need it. The society needs it. The population needs it. The voters need it. What we've seen in the last several years is that investigative journalism is done more by boutique outfits, right? The Type Media Center, the Type Investigations, which put together this book, is one example. ProPublica, obviously, Reveal. Andrea's associated with WNYC, and then the podcast lives, I guess, between ProPublica and WNYC, Trump Inc. So there's amazing investigative journalism being done. Some of it tethered to full service news organizations like WNYC. A lot of it, I think, really a lot of the strongest work being done in these nonprofit funded, grant funded publications that work from investigation to investigation. And thank God they're there, because they're doing important work and they're uncovering important things. I think of that story, I guess it's more than a year ago now, but that whole series on Black maternal death, right, infant mortality. That was from a nonprofit investigative journalism operation. And then it got picked up everywhere else. So there's investigative journalism being done, and it's necessary, and it gets to the people who already care about investigative journalism. What's different, and I think an impoverishment from years ago when the Daily News or New York Newsday had a whole investigative desk, and any paper in your hometown had an investigative desk, right? I grew up with a Newhouse newspaper in Western Massachusetts, and there was a guy who was the Jack Newfield of Springfield, right? His name was Jack Flynn, and he read the records, and he read the court documents, and he did that stuff. None of those kinds of papers do that kind of work anymore.
Right.
And so there's a huge problem in the farm system, right? There's a huge problem in the farm team system in how we get trained and how we get up to these jobs. And then there's a huge problem in the distribution system of who gets to know these things. If you follow ProPublica, if you follow Reveal, if you follow Type Investigations, then you get to know about these great stories that they do. But it used to be if you open the Daily News on a given day, or if you open New York Newsday on a given day, and you might have been going for the funnies, but then you'd get this stuff, right? And you might have been reading the Village Voice for the rock criticism, but you would be exposed to Barrett and Robbins and Conason. And you're not anymore, because those sort of general interest publications don't exist by and large. I think I want to take a second, because I'm thinking about sort of what Wayne knew, what all of those reporters who worked in the general interest, the Voice is special, but really the way it operated is there was something for everybody in these pages. Whereas now we get corralled boutique news just for our own interests, right? Because the algorithm knows what we want to read, and that's what it sends us. There is what's a lot harder, I think, for investigative reporters now is that not enough people work on a beat. And so when you work on a beat, you just accumulate this knowledge and one story leads to the next. And something you worked on now, you might be able to use 6 years from now in some other thing, some piece of knowledge that was in your head. And clearly Wayne Barrett operated that way. You know, Jim Dwyer died today, another absolute, you know, like absolute giant of New York journalism, who was both that bard of the city, that poet in newsprint in the Hamill Breslin lineage, and the really news breaking investigative reporter as well. I think about 102 Minutes, his diagnosis of the minutes of the falling of the World Trade Center, and they knew so much. If you're able to work that way for so long, you're able to accumulate so much knowledge, right? We talk about when an old man dies, a library dies with him. When an old woman dies, a library dies with her. And people who were able to work in that sort of a system that was more general interest and that was more stable.
Right. And we're certainly going to miss
this knowledge. Yeah.
Right.
So Dwyer is another fantastic example, very different personality, very different kind of writing than Wayne,
Right.
but similar vast understanding of how the city operates, vast stores of stories and compassion and wisdom on how this Gotham works.
We're going to have to wind down, but we are going to miss Jim Dwyer, and we are going to miss we miss Wayne. I want to thank the panelists so much for coming and sharing your knowledge of Wayne. And it's a really great book, and I learned so much about him from it. And I hope those of you who are out there will buy the book and read it. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mac Barrett for questions from the audience.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Governor Cuomo. Thank you, President Raab. Thank you, Harold Holzer. Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Cheryl. This has been an excellent conversation. I know my mother and I are both just moved that we can celebrate my dad's work in this way with this, beautifully thoughtful conversation. I do have some questions that have come in from throughout the conversation, and hopefully these are not going to overlap with what's already been discussed. I've selected them so that they can try to lead us in some new directions. The first one is from Roosevelt House Director Harold Holzer. First he compliments the event. This is the best gathering of investigative journalists and opinion makers since Jack Newfield dined alone. Can anyone explain and expand on Wayne's extraordinary way of annihilating folks in print and retaining their friendship? As Governor Cuomo described, and I should add, it happened to me more than once. Was it that we were playing the long game, or Wayne never took things personally and wanted you to stay close for the next interrogation, or all of the above? And that's for anybody and everybody.
I can tell you that Wayne did not take it personally. That to him, it was the joy of doing the story. And there were a couple of people. I mentioned one of them earlier, who he considered outside the pale. But everybody else, he focused on the sin and not the sinner. So that he believed that despite those stories that he wrote about Mario Cuomo and the Sleaze team and many others, I remember when I was at The Voice, me, Bill Bastone, and Wayne combined on a story that led to Mario not speaking to Wayne or Jack for about 6 months. Wayne would say, well, Mario would soak. If I wrote a tough story about Andrew, I couldn't get him off the phone to stop talking about it, no matter what I said. Wayne, I think, believed that he could always go back to people, and I think that was one of his sort of fearless approaches to the work he did. Just because he knocked you last week didn't mean he was going to pick up the phone and saying, "How you doing?"
And unless anybody else has anything to add to that, I'll go to another one. So an unnamed questioner says, essentially he wants to know why it is that the type of journalism my father did is as rare as it is today. Is this due to the decline in the business model of print journalism, or just plain degradation of standards / rigor today? Or was it the exception even in his time?
I mean, I guess to some degree, right, we're saying that it's an exception, right? Like Donald Trump's business interests, Rudy Giuliani's budget choices, these were all available for everyone to write about. So in some ways, his lens or the way he thought about things was unique, and that's what made him special. But there are great reporters doing great work. We have one with us. We have two with us, right? We have three with us. And we certainly can't say that investigative reporting is dead, right? We all read that tax story last week. That was only last week. That was only last Monday. You know, a story that took, what, 6 years to report? And that left us all with greater knowledge about something important. And we could all run off a litany of really important and groundbreaking stories written in the last couple of years. So there is still really valuable investigative journalism being produced by people who really feel strongly about its need. What's different, I think, is that there's so much nonsense for us to read, right? There's so many dancing chickens to watch. And so it puts a big emphasis on the reader, on the news consumer, to make, you know, quality choices. You can't have candy all day long and still expect that you're going to get good governance.
Yep. And there's a question, we're focused very much, as we should be to an extent, on my dad's reporting on Trump and on other big names, but this is a question that gets at another important aspect of his career, which was the more local investigative reporting that he did. Ralph is asking, to what extent has the focus on national scandals, particularly Trump, sucked the life out of local investigative reporting?
I don't think it's the focus. I think it's the, I mean, I just don't actually agree with that. So I think that there is a lot of really good local investigative reporting going on. There's a lot of local investigative reporting going on in this city. There's also a lot of distraction. The other thing that I would really point out is that when Wayne was writing about Donald Trump, he was not really a national figure. Rudy Giuliani was not a national figure. I think that they became national figures, and I think it's sort of a tribute to the idea of local journalism having national, international significance that a lot of Wayne's work still stands. So I'm not going to bemoan the decline of investigative journalism. I mean, I do think that the decline of local newspapers is a related phenomenon, which has an awful lot to do with the corrosion of democracy. But I feel like it's been a really hard time to work as a journalist. The president calls us the enemy of the people, which, for those who don't know, is a phrase from Joseph Stalin. He or his campaign are suing journalists right now for their work. He regularly threatens to ruin people, ruin journalists. I myself have been the subject of Don Jr.'s Twitter ire. It's unfun.
Badge of honor, Andrea.
Yeah. But it's still, the thing is that, I mean, it was for a lie that I caught Ivanka in her speech at the Republican National Convention. But it still doesn't feel good to have all this sort of negative incoming. It feels kind of scary. So I think that in light of that, and you know, that's just one example. I mean, there are other people that are much more on the front lines than I am. I think that there is really a lot of good work going on, and I am going to stick up for that at the moment. However, I'm also going to say, support all of these independent investigative journalism outlets, because this stuff is expensive and it's difficult. And also buy the book about Wayne.
Yes, maybe the question shouldn't have been, why is there less investigative reporting on the local level, but more, why is there less attention for it?
Yeah, and I mean, it's like she's saying, it's the local is where these stories are born, right? You find things out if you're on a beat. If you're a local reporter, you're able to follow piece by piece until you find a big story. And Andrea is exactly right that Wayne was a local reporter. He was only a national reporter really during the Trump election campaign. And he maybe wrote some national stories in those years after, some Rudy national stories in those years after 2011. But all of this great reporting was local. And, you know, everybody on the screen is a local reporter, right? These are New York reporters who sometimes write about national things, right? Like Andrea's following a local boy into the national, but after a long career as a New York City reporter, right? Grounded here and then covering plenty.
Yeah, I mean, it's so, when I started to write my book, what happened was that I actually hadn't really thought about this way, but my editor from Norton came to me and he said, why don't you write a story about the Trumps and the Kushners? You know these people. You have all the sources. And I thought about it and I was like, you know, it's true. I do know them. And I mean, it turned out I knew even more of them than I knew that I knew. So it is, I do think that really having this incredible local journalism grounding is something that informs our world in a very big and important way.
Well, we're hitting the outer limits of how long this event could be, but I just want to ask maybe one or two more, if that's okay with everybody, and then we can wrap up. So here's one from Daniel Chan. Would Wayne have been surprised by the excesses and blunders that this president has exhibited, or did Wayne predict this behavior?
No. And as a matter of fact, I have to say that in the course of, so after I had written my book and it was about to be published, I was started to do a sort of podcast excerpt, and I had read so much of Wayne's books and his work so carefully. And I found in the WNYC archives, which is just like sort of another like great Wayne story, an interview with Wayne from 1992 in which he was talking about Trump. And the Trump that he described in 1992 when his book first came out was exactly the Donald Trump that we know now. But, you know, the sort of helping himself to taxpayer dollars, to only being out from himself, to sitting up late at night eating cheeseburgers, talking to the TV. Like Wayne had that. And Eileen is right. He had it from reporting. And it was unbelievable to go back almost 30 years and hear in his voice his descriptions of Donald Trump, and to understand that it is the very same man that now the world has gotten to know.
And where's a good place to end? I want to just ask something that's open-ended for everybody to respond to as a note to finish on. Let's see, did the Village Voice, obviously such an important part of my dad's life and career, why did it go out of business ultimately? Do you think that the liberal bent of the Village Voice contributed to its demise? And how strong was the support that the Village Voice gave its journalists? So that's a combination of several questions.
I think Tom should answer.
Well, you know, Mac, I've always said that the Voice was a victim of its own success. You know, when it was before the age of the internet, the Voice was so fat with ads, you literally couldn't fold it in half and put it under your arm. People waited at the newsstands in Sheridan Square and Astor Place on Tuesday night to get it because of the ads. They weren't waiting there, you know, to get Wayne's stories, but they certainly read Wayne's stories and everything else that was in there. But it was, you know, whether you were shopping for a futon or for a record or for looking to go to see what, you know, the Village Voice was one-stop shopping. It was the place to go. And I mean, it's so ironic. I teach now at a school called the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism, which is because he gave a substantial, Craig Newmark, who founded something called Craigslist, gave a substantial amount of money to our school. It gave him naming rights. And he seems to be a wonderful fellow. But Craigslist and operations like it just sucked the revenue, you know, out of not just the Voice, but many publications. You know, I mean, we see it in the broadsheets as well. The New York Times used to have an enormous weekly section of want ads for jobs. You know, all that stuff vanished. the legs got pulled out from under every print publication with the era of the internet, and none of them were ready for it. None of them were sufficiently prepared to be able to figure out a model that would sort of figure out a way to have people pay for something that they wanted. So now we sort of end up in these hybrid situations where some charge and some don't, and there's gatekeepers and on some sites and gatekeepers are not. I mean, The Voice ended up with some pretty lousy owners at the end, unfortunately. You know, Rupert Murdoch owned it at one point. These cowboys from Phoenix, as I call them, who wrote in, they're the ones who fired Wayne, you know. They loved the name. They really didn't love what The Voice was about, and they were sort of trying to squeeze every last nickel out of it. I still believe that there is a place for a publication like The Voice in a place like New York. I absolutely believe that. There's no reason why you could not reconstitute with sufficient funding to launch it once again. I don't know if it would necessarily be a print project, but it could be done. You know, the stuff that we generate, and some places are doing it. You know, I'm on the board of this thing, the city.com or the .org, which covers New York. It's a nonprofit organization. The Gothamist does it, or WNYC. You know, there are a lot that are trying to do it. The Voice did it with a combination of sass and verve and liveliness that nobody else could duplicate. And you know, that vanished when they finally pulled the plug on the paper, but I think it could happen again.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everybody. You know, we're gathered tonight in the name of one hero that we've lost, honoring another hero we've lost, and on the very day that we lose another, I just want to send my thoughts and prayers to the family of Jim Dwyer. What an unspeakable, devastating loss. I hope that in some way we honor his memory with this conversation.
He would be very proud to be associated with it. He loved Wayne.
And he was part of the advisory board for the Wayne Barrett Project, which first spent a few years funding investigative journalism in the style of Wayne Barrett through Type Investigations at Type Media Center, and then came up with the idea of the project for this book. And when we were coming up with this incredibly long title, in which I wanted to get the words relentless and dogged in there, and first, and journalism, and how many, you know, search words can we get in the title? Dwyer was at a lot of those meetings. This one he was at only by phone, and so the voice came from the console in the middle of the table at Type saying, "You need a short word. Put a short word in the middle." The Gaelic short word in the middle, brave. Right? So that's why it says brave in the middle. There's enough of those 3-syllable words. Put brave in the middle. Yeah.
Thank you all so much. This has been fantastic. And with that, good night.
Thanks so much, Mac.
Thank you so much, Mac. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Cheryl.
Thank you.